Right, so the BBC has once again been caught platforming hate, presumably for a ratings boost, as its incessant platforming of the likes of Nigel Farage and Richard Tice, and most notably in the last few days, comments by Lee Anderson. So isn't it lovely that Reform UK are getting such widespread platforming on the BBC, so impartial, when they already have the likes of GB News or Talk TV to do that for them? It's a dangerous game the establishment media is playing with its dalliances with the hard right of British politics, because the more people see of them, the more their ideas and policies become ingrained. And if the BBC thinks that people won't be taken in by that sort of thing, seeing these nonsense politicians in terms of ratings boosts, and that what they say is an irrelevance, then well, it really isn't working. The BBC's reputation has already been hammered because of its inherent bias towards the status quo. And people are sick of it, sick of this bias constantly being shoved in their faces to the point they are taking their licence fees away and walking with it, wanting our supposedly impartial largest media outlet to actually be fair in its news delivery and its guest selection. But it never is. So it is absolutely fair and justified to say Britain is choosing to cancel the BBC, and actually, it completely deserves it.
The message I'm getting loud and clear from my constituents is that they are fed up with seeing police dancing around rainbows and being nice to people and running off from rioters. They want the police to do their job. And I think these police yesterday should be commended. They should, in fact, I'd give them a medal.
Right, so that was a clip of the most recent interview of Lee Anderson on the BBC, being allowed by the BBC to spout off about an absolutely disgusting attack by a Greater Manchester police officer at a Stand Up to Racism campaign. The BBC choosing to interview, of all people, Lee Flaming Anderson over an anti-racism protest. Just the fact it was a stand-up to racism event should have precluded Anderson, of all people pretty much, being interviewed in response to that, given his own repeated, deeply unpleasant conduct over the last few years. Not least incidents including referring to London Mayor Sadiq Khan as being under the control of Islamists, which saw him suspended from the Tory party, but then he carried on by saying Khan had given London to his mates. Anderson is a guy who attacks food banks, believing you can survive on 30p meals, which he couldn't actually prove, but earned him the nickname 30p Lee. He's also verbally attacked asylum seekers and even footballers for daring to take the knee. Of all people, the BBC chose to ask him about an anti-racism demonstration for a soundbite, for a comment, after a protester got taken to the floor, had his head kicked like a football, and then stamped on, leaving him with significant injuries. And Anderson in that clip there said, in response to that act by that police officer, that he should get a medal for it. What he got was a suspension, which is just what he should have got. But that sadly sums the BBC up these days. Little wonder people have been so angry in light of that interview, and indeed for all the last few years as well. They've carried on in this vein. Therefore, it is little wonder a great many people are now abandoning the BBC and taking their licence fee cash with them. But the BBC appears to still not actually be getting the message. Actually concluding the drop in licence fee payers is down to something else entirely, which, although possibly one reason, certainly isn't one that I've come across before. You see, the BBC's annual report has just come out, and it has shown that in the UK, 23.9 million households still pay for a TV licence, or were paying for a TV licence over the last year, but that this is actually down on the previous year to the tune of 500,000 households. The BBC's conclusion for people switching them off? The cost of living crisis. The licence fee is currently £169.50, which works out at about £14 a month if paid monthly. So for people who are struggling to make ends meet, paying the licence fee it's been ditched some time ago if it's the difference between them eating and not eating. Well, before they are at the point of choosing to eat or not, £14 a month isn't really a huge sum, as a lot of other people might be considering, but it could well be more than some people can afford. The BBC is down £80 million over the last year as a result of that. And in a bid to head this off, the BBC are offering half-price licences if certain criteria are met. I've yet to see anyone publicly say that this is their reason for turning the BBC off, though. Perhaps some have. I dare say some will seek to get the half-price licence fee anyway if they do meet this new criteria. But will it attract anyone who has cancelled their licence fees back at all, especially if they've cancelled them for completely different reasons? I guess we'll see in next year's report, where I would expect take-up of half-price licence fees to be a reasonable number as people seek to save money, but I also expect that full price figure to drop again too, because ultimately their content, especially their news content, is insultingly poor. The BBC's income has dropped by 30% over the last 10 years, implying a deeper-rooted problem than just the cost of living crisis. And it's no surprise why, which I'll come on to in a moment. What is more likely, though, is that when people are trying to tighten their belts and make ends meet, they're more likely to take their licence fee money away, stop paying it at all, but they're equally likely to just take their subscription to another service like Netflix or Disney Plus for their entertainment and value for money. And certainly as far as news is concerned, more people are seeking it out online where they get a greater variety of input, and that of course extends to YouTube and other social media as well. You also wouldn't believe, and I fully expect to get comments on this video about this as well, how many people are turning the BBC off because they think it's been taken over by woke lefties. They bemoan the fact that the Tories didn't cancel the licence fee completely, because why should they pay for such rotten lefty dogma, seeing it as a tax that should be cut by the Tories, who are supposed to be all about low tax. So they've got a funny way of showing that. I don't completely disagree with that notion in and of itself, but coming at it from the left, as I do, obviously, and recognising the BBC not to be left-wing, but in fact overtly right-wing, I'm also not unique in thinking that, be right-wing, left-wing, centrist, or whatever. A poll by Electoral Calculus, for example, on the value of the BBC licence fee conducted back in 2022 found that 71% of respondents thought the licence fee was poor value for money. Well, you've got Laura Koonsberg literally chewing a wasp through the general election night coverage recently, didn't we, as she saw her beloved Tories implode. She is the standout example of client journalism, and her pro-Tory proclivities have been commented on many occasions and derided for a long, long time. When you actually look at who runs the BBC, especially its news service, the commentary of right-wing figures attacking the BBC for being full of lefties falls flat. It doesn't carry weight. It will still damage the BBC too, and have people turning off as a consequence. The Director General of the BBC is Tim Davie, a former chair of a local Conservative association and a former council candidate for that party. The former chairman of the BBC was, of course, Richard Sharp, who helped facilitate a loan for Boris Johnson, was literally a Tory party donor, as well as a donor to the eternally on the BBC right-wing think tank, the Centre for Policy Studies. And he was a former Goldman Sachs banker, where he was the boss at that time of a certain Rishi Sunak. It was only in the aftermath of that bank loan scandal he stood down. Robbie Gibb is a former head of politics at the BBC before he swanned off to become Theresa May's head of communications when she became Prime Minister. The fact he was allowed back into the BBC after that as a board member is ridiculous. But even more so when he was an ardent Brexiteer with influence over the news agenda at that time, and was literally called a Tory insider by then Newsnight presenter Emily Maitlis. And then there was the appointment as head of news of John McAndrew, who had literally come to that job from GB News as their editorial director, a channel which had 5 of its shows found guilty by even the ordinarily useless Ofcom of materially misleading its audience. He's now gone as well, thankfully, though. But this is always the way. This is how the BBC has for decades been run. The appointments to certain positions being made by government, meaning the BBC always gets skewed towards the narrative and the political leanings of the government of the day, and when we only ever have successive right-wing governments, whichever party is in power, the BBC directly ends up reflecting that. More and more people are aware of it and walking away from it because of that. The BBC's plain lack of impartiality is what is driving people away, and has been for years. And although people from different political persuasions will argue over whether it is because the BBC is too left-wing or too right-wing, the net result is the same. And there's no future for the BBC if it cannot rescue its own reputation for impartiality. And for that, there needs, I think, to be a wholesale clear-out and the removal of political appointments, making the body truly independent and no longer under the cosh of having that licence fee of theirs threatened not just by us not paying it, but by governments holding it over their heads all the time, whenever they stray too close to actually doing their job properly. For more on BBC and who it chooses to platform and who it doesn't, it gets even more extreme than the clowns of Reform UK, as this video recommendation will give you more details about, again, bringing into question the editorial decisions of too many right-wingers behind the scenes at the BBC. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.